A black belt's prank turned into a viral nightmare. Will he ever escape the internet's wrath? James Whitaker, a 32-year-old martial arts instructor from Leeds, had spent half his life mastering Taekwondo. With a third-degree black belt and a small dojo where he taught kids and adults, he was respected in his community not just for his high kicks but for his discipline and humility, or so everyone thought. On a crisp October morning in 2024, during a lad's trip to London, James made a decision that would unravel everything. It started innocently enough. James and his mates, hyped up on pub crawls and tourist vibes, were wandering near Buckingham Palace. The royal guards, stoic in their red tunics and bearskin hats, were a spectacle. James, always the show-off, bet his friend Tom a pint that he could make a guard flinch with one of his signature spinning heel kicks without actually hitting him, of course. "Just a bit of fun," he said, grinning. His mates egged him on, phones already recording, but James misjudged. Maybe it was the adrenaline, the jet lag from a recent competition in Seoul, or the 2 pints at lunch. As he spun, his foot clipped the guard's cheek, not a graze, but a solid smack. The guard, a 24-year-old lance corporal named Henry Clark, stumbled but stayed upright, his face a mask of shock and pain. The crowd gasped. James froze, hands up, stammering, "Mate, I didn't mean." His mates' laughter died as two other guards stepped forward, rifles at the ready. By evening, the clip was everywhere, posted on X by Tom with the caption "Lads Taekwondo vs. Royal Guard epic fail." It racked up to million views in hours. TikTok remixes added dramatic music. YouTubers dissected James' form, mocking his drunk ninja spin. X posts ranged from absolute legend to lock him up for disrespecting the Queen's Guard. The video showed James kick in slow motion, Henry's head snapping back, and the awkward moment where James tried to apologize before being hustled away by police. James thought it would blow over. He apologized profusely at the scene, and Henry, after a medical check, had only a bruised cheek, no broken bones. The Metropolitan Police issued James a caution for behavior likely to cause a breach of the peace but let him go with a warning. Back at his hotel, he laughed it off with his mates, saying, "Well, that's one for the pub stories." He had no idea what was coming. By Monday, the story had hit tabloids. The Sun rang Kung Fu kicker Shamus Nation, painting James as a reckless thug. Daily Mail dug up his dojo's website, quoting an anonymous parent, "He's meant to teach discipline, not attack soldiers." X was worse. Users doxed James' address, flooded his dojo's Google reviews with 1-star ratings, and tagged his sponsors, local gyms and a sportswear brand, in demands to drop him. A viral thread claimed James had bragged about the kick in a now deleted X post. He hadn't. James tried to fight back. He posted a shaky apology video on X. "I'm gutted about what happened. It was an accident, not malice. I've reached out to the guard to make it right." It got 10,000 likes but 50,000 quote posts tearing him apart. "You kicked a man doing his job," one read. "Black belt in stupidity," said another. His dojo's phone rang off the hook with hate calls. Parents pulled their kids from classes. By Wednesday, his main sponsor dropped him, citing brand misalignment. Amid the chaos, Henry Clark, the guard, spoke up. In a rare interview with BBC Radio 4, arranged through the Ministry of Defense, he downplayed the incident. "It was a daft mistake, not a proper fight," Henry said, his Yorkshire accent warm. "I've taken worse in training." The lads apologized, and I'm not one for grudges. He even joked, "My mates say I've got a face made for kicking now." Ex-users latched onto Henry's chill vibe with memes of him as unflappable guard Chad. Some called for James to be let off the hook, but the mob was louder. Henry's words gave James a flicker of hope. He messaged Henry through a mutual contact, offering to meet and apologize in person. To his shock, Henry agreed. They met quietly at a London cafe, no cameras. Henry, off-duty in jeans and a hoodie, was blunt but kind. "You cocked up, mate, but this online bollocks is too much." Just own it and move on. James offered to donate his dojo's next month's profits to a veterans charity Henry supported. Henry nodded, saying, "That's a start." James thought the worst was over, but karma had one more lesson. Back in Leeds, his dojo was struggling. Enrollment was down 60%, and he couldn't afford rent. He started teaching free community classes to rebuild trust, but the internet's memory was long. Then, in December, a new ex-post surfaced, a blurry video from a 2019 pub brawl where James, visibly drunk, threw a sloppy punch at a bouncer. Though no charges were filed, the clip reignited the hate. "See, he's always been a thug," read the top comment. Desperate, James leaned into transparency. He went live on YouTube, admitting his past mistakes, the pub fight, his cocky attitude, the reckless kick. "I'm not perfect," he said, voice cracking. "I've let down my students, my family, and myself. But I'm trying to be better." He announced he'd step back from teaching to retrain as a counselor for at-risk youth, using his martial arts background to help kids avoid his path. The live stream got mixed reactions. Some praised his honesty, others called it a PR stunt. 6 months had passed since the incident that turned James's life upside down, and by April 2025, the air in Maplewood carried the faint promise of spring blossoms on the cherry trees, the scent of damp earth after rain. But for James, rebuilding felt like wading through mud. The viral video of him kicking a royal guard outside Buckingham Palace during a drunken night in London still lingered like a shadow, its grainy frames etched into the internet's memory. His Taekwondo dojo, once a bustling hub where he'd trained local kids and adults alike, had shuttered within weeks of the scandal. Parents pulled their children from classes, whispering about that reckless black belt, and the lease on the Maplewood studio became an expense he couldn't justify. The loss stung not just the business, but the sense of purpose it gave him, the rhythm of teaching kicks and forms under the hum of fluorescent lights. Now, James poured his energy into volunteering at the Maplewood Youth Center, a squat brick building on the edge of town where kids gathered after school to escape the pull of boredom or trouble. He taught basic Taekwondo in a cramped gymnasium, the floor scuffed from years of sneakers, to a ragtag group of kids who couldn't afford private lessons. There was Mia, a wiry 12-year-old with a quick jab and a quicker temper. Jamal, a shy teen who lit up when he nailed a roundhouse kick. And little Aisha, who giggled through every stance but never missed a class. James found solace in their progress, in the way their eyes widened when he showed them how to pivot their hips for power. "You're not just kicking," he'd tell them, his voice steady but warm. "You're learning control over your body, your choices." The words were as much for him as for them. Teaching kept him grounded, a lifeline to the man he'd been before that night in London. Henry, his old friend from his university days in London, remained a constant. The two had reconnected after the incident, Henry's dry humor cutting through James's shame like a blade through fog. They'd meet for pints at the Rusty Anchor, a pub on Maplewood's main street with sticky tables and a jukebox that always played the same Springsteen songs. Henry, now a history teacher with a penchant for storytelling, would lean back in his chair, nursing a stout, and say, "Mate, you're not the first to make a fool of yourself, and you won't be the last." Their conversations ranged from football to philosophy, but inevitably circled back to that night, the moment James, drunk on cheap lager and bravado, had lashed out at the stoic guard, thinking it was a lark until the internet turned it into a spectacle. Henry's advice, scribbled on a napkin during one of those nights, was now pinned to James's fridge: "Own it and move on." The words were simple, but they'd become his mantra, a reminder that mistakes didn't have to define him. The viral video still haunted him, though. At Tesco, picking up milk and bread, he'd catch strangers staring, their whispers sharp as needles. "That's the guard kicker," a teenager once approached, phone in hand, asking for a selfie with the guy from that video. James forced a smile, but inside, the humiliation burned. X had mostly moved on new scandals, new memes, but the internet never truly forgot. Every few weeks, a random post would resurface the clip, sparking a fresh wave of comments. What an idiot, or worse, he deserved worse than losing his dojo. James had learned to avoid reading them, but the sting lingered, a reminder of how one reckless moment could ripple outward, reshaping a life. His small apartment on the edge of Maplewood reflected his new reality. Spartan, with a sagging couch, a second-hand coffee table, and a single-framed photo of him and his students at the dojo's grand opening, their smiles frozen in a happier time. The black belt he'd earned after years of discipline hung on a hook by the door, its fabric frayed but still a symbol of who he was or who he wanted to be again. James had always thought a black belt meant mastery, invincibility. Now he knew better. It didn't shield you from bad choices, from the weight of consequences, or from the internet's unforgiving gaze. It didn't stop the nightmares where he relived the kick, the guard's unflinching stare, the crowd's gasps, but it reminded him of resilience, of the hours spent perfecting forms, of the strength to start over. Maplewood itself was a mixed blessing. The town's quiet streets, lined with oak trees and modest homes, offered a refuge from London's chaos where the incident had happened during a weekend trip. But small towns had long memories, and James felt the weight of familiar faces, neighbors who nodded politely but kept their distance, shopkeepers who raised an eyebrow when he walked in. He avoided the town square's coffee shop, where he'd once been a regular, unable to face the barista who jokingly called him kicker last month. Instead, he found solace in routine, mornings jogging along the river, afternoons at the youth center, evenings reading martial arts, philosophy, or sketching new training drills. His relationship with the Royal Guards had changed forever. Once, he'd admired their stoicism, their discipline mirroring the focus he'd honed in Taekwondo. Now, he gave Buckingham Palace a wide berth on his rare trips to London, the sight of a red tunic enough to twist his stomach. He'd written an apology letter to the Coldstream Guards after the incident, a halting, handwritten note he'd mailed with no expectation of a reply. None came, but he didn't expect forgiveness, just the chance to own his mistake. The guard he'd kicked, a young man whose name James never learned, had stood like a statue, his silence louder than any reprimand. That image stayed with James, a lesson in dignity he'd failed to match that night. The kids at the youth center were his redemption, though he'd never admit it out loud. Mia's fierce determination, Jamal's quiet progress, Aisha's infectious joy, they reminded him why he'd fallen in love with teaching. One evening, after a class where Jamal landed his first perfect spinning kick, the boy lingered, scuffing his sneakers on the gym floor. "You ever mess up big, coach?" he asked, his voice low. James paused, the weight of the question heavy. "Yeah," he said finally, meeting Jamal's eyes. "Big enough to lose a lot, but you keep going. You make it right one step at a time." Jamal nodded, and James felt a spark of hope, like a seed breaking through frost. By April's end, James was finding his footing. The youth center's director had offered him a part-time paid role, a small step toward stability. He and Henry planned a weekend fishing trip, a chance to laugh without the shadow of the past. The whispers at Tesco were fading, replaced by new town gossip: a mayor's scandal, a local bakery's viral cupcake. James still checked X occasionally, bracing for old wounds, but the video's traction had dwindled, buried under fresher controversies. He wasn't free of it, not entirely. The internet's memory was long, and his own was longer, but he was learning to live with it. One quiet evening, James stood in his kitchen, the fridge door open, Henry's note catching the light: "Own it and move on." He thought of the guard, of the kids, of the man he'd been and the one he was becoming. A black belt didn't make you invincible, but it taught you to stand up after a fall. James closed the fridge, grabbed his running shoes, and stepped into the cool spring night, the stars above Maplewood bright with possibility. Some lessons, he knew, you only needed to learn once, but the learning, the growing, that was a lifelong fight. And he was ready to keep fighting.